"That's not your father. He's a uniform mistake trying to blend in with real people," Richard, my father-in-law, said, cutting through the Christmas party silence like a sharp blade. 500 people stopped talking. The event cameras, hired to document the charity party of the year, captured every word, every cruel laugh that followed. My father, William, stood in the middle of the main hall, holding a glass of water with slightly trembling hands. He was wearing his best suit, the same one he wore to my graduation 15 years ago. It still fit perfectly, but against the backdrop of Italian marble and crystal chandeliers of the Blackwell mansion, it looked exactly what Richard wanted everyone to see: out of place. "My name is Eric, I'm 32 years old, and I just watched the man who raised me alone be humiliated in front of 1,000 people and a professional film crew." What Richard didn't know was that I wasn't surprised. In fact, I had been expecting it. The party was being held at the Blackwell estate in Connecticut, 23 acres of manicured grounds, a 42-room Georgian mansion, and a prime view of Long Island Sound. It was the social event of the season, bringing together politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and the entire East Coast elite. My wife Jessica stood beside me, beautiful in her midnight blue silk gown that cost more than my father earned in 3 months as a janitor at the city hospital. She laughed. Not a nervous giggle or an embarrassed smile. A genuine laugh, as if my father's humiliation was the funniest joke of the night. "Dad's right," she whispered to her cousin beside her. "I don't even know why Eric insisted on bringing him. It's embarrassing." That's when something broke inside me. It wasn't anger, it was crystal clarity. Richard continued, now with a microphone in his hand, turning private humiliation into public spectacle. "You know, it's Christmas, a time for charity. And charity begins at home, doesn't it? Sometimes we have to accept certain situations for the sake of family." Laughter echoed through the hall. Cameras rolled. Celebrities smiled. My father stood motionless, as if he had learned over the years that staying quiet was the only way to survive moments like this. I knew that stance. I'd seen it before, when other parents mocked him at school meetings because he showed up in his work uniform. When neighbors commented on the janitor raising an architect. When Jessica told me, at our first dinner with her family, that maybe it would be better to invent a different profession for him. But this time was different. This time I had the power to do something about it. Richard had no idea that while he was orchestrating this moment of public humiliation, I already owned 47% of Blackwell Holdings. 3 years of quiet acquisitions, strategic investments, and a patience he never had the intelligence to recognize. While he laughed at my humble heritage, I was just 5% away from completely controlling the empire he had spent 30 years building. My father looked at me across the room. Not with shame, but with that expression I had known since I was a child, the one that said, "Hang in there, son, it'll pass." The same expression he had when he worked 3 shifts to pay for my architecture degree at MIT. That's when I made my final decision. If you're enjoying this story of how a moment of humiliation became the catalyst for the most calculated revenge of the Connecticut elite, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because what happened in the next 72 hours not only changed the Blackwell family's life, but completely redefined what it means to underestimate someone. I smiled at Richard across the room, raised my champagne glass in a silent toast, and began making the calls he never imagined I could make. The party was just getting started. Richard Blackwell had always had a gift for turning cruelty into art. For the next 15 minutes, I would watch him orchestrate a humiliation so systematic it seemed rehearsed. "William, isn't that right?" Richard continued, now circling the party like a talk show host, the microphone amplifying his every venomous word. "Tell our guests what you do for a living." My father remained silent, clutching his glass of water as if it were a shield. I knew this tactic. Richard had used the same strategy on me during our first family dinner 3 years ago, forcing me to explain my humble origins as if they were a flaw that needed to be justified. "He's a janitor at St. Mary's Hospital," Jessica answered for him, her voice laden with a contempt she never bothered to hide. "He's been there for 26 years. 26 years. Richard exclaimed, theatrically. "What admirable dedication. And tell me, William, what exactly does a janitor do? For our guests who may never have interacted with that type of professional." The cameras moved closer. Flashes went off. 500 people waited for an answer that would turn my father into entertainment. I knew exactly what Richard was doing because I had studied his tactics for years. It wasn't just casual cruelty, It was a calculated display of power. A way to remind everyone in the room where the social hierarchy stood, using my father as an example of what happens when you don't know your place. Richard Blackwell had built his real estate empire through precisely this kind of psychological intimidation. He bought properties from vulnerable families for fractions of their real value, not through brute force, but through systematic humiliation that broke people's resistance. He was a predator who fed on the dignity of others. "I clean the rooms where people stay," my father finally replied, his voice low but firm. "I make sure they are safe and comfortable when they need it most." The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Then came the laughter, first from Richard, then Jessica, then spreading through the room like a virus. "How poetic!" Richard applauded. A philosopher janitor. Eric certainly got his creativity from somewhere, didn't he? That was the Richard the first knew intimately. The man who, during our honeymoon, had joked that I must feel uncomfortable being supported by my wife's family money. The same man who suggested I change my last name to Blackwell, to make business easier. The man who turned every professional achievement of mine into a gift of their generosity. But what Richard never understood, and this would be his downfall, was that I had spent years meticulously documenting every one of his tactics, every pattern of behavior, every weak spot in his armor of arrogance. During the 3 years of my marriage to Jessica, I watched Richard systematically destroy anyone who threatened his sense of superiority. A business partner who questioned his methods found himself under investigation for alleged tax fraud. A neighbor who complained about the height of his fence discovered that his property taxes had mysteriously tripled. A former employee who threatened to expose his questionable labor practices simply disappeared from the job market, blacklisted without explanation. Richard operated through a network of corrupt contacts, political favors, and subtle blackmail. He didn't just hurt people, he erased them. And Jessica was his most devoted disciple. "Dad, you have to tell the story of how you met William," she said, her eyes sparkling with a mischief I had learned to recognize. "It's hilarious." Richard smiled, recognizing his cue. "Oh yes. Well, when Eric introduced us to his father, I thought it was some kind of test. You know how young people are these days, always trying to educate us about social acceptance." He made air quotes with his fingers. I figured that in a few minutes he would reveal that William was actually a businessman in disguise or something. More laughter. Camera flashes. My father remained motionless, a statue of dignity amid the chaos. "But no," Richard continued. "He really is just that. A janitor. And Eric actually expected us to socialize with him." It was at that moment that I fully understood the extent of my own naivety. For 3 years, I had believed that I could be a bridge between two worlds. That my professional success would eventually earn them respect. That Jessica loved me enough to defend our family. I was wrong about everything. Jessica never loved me. She loved the idea of turning me into something else. Richard never respected me. He tolerated me as his daughter's charity project. And I was never part of the family. I was an interesting mascot they could show off when convenient and humiliate when bored. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated not only my intelligence, but my patience. While Richard continued his public spectacle, I discreetly checked my phone. 3 messages confirming that the final transfers had been processed. In 62 hours, I would go from tolerated son-in-law to majority controller of Blackwell Holdings. "Eric," Richard now addressed me directly, "don't you think you should have prepared your father for an event of this magnitude? Perhaps explained basic social protocol." I smiled calmly. "Actually, Richard, I think Dad behaved exactly as he should have. With class, dignity, and honesty, qualities that some here seem to have forgotten." Richard's smile faltered for a split second. Jessica shot me a warning glance. The people around us fell silent, sensing the sudden tension. "Careful, Eric," Richard said, his voice dropping to a more dangerous tone. "Remember where you are. And who made your presence here possible." "Oh, I remember perfectly well," I replied, my voice remaining cordial. "And I'm sure that after tonight, no one here will forget this conversation." Richard interpreted this as submission. Jessica relaxed, thinking I had backed down. The cameras captured my seemingly defeated smile. None of them realized that my smile wasn't one of capitulation, it was one of anticipation. Because in less than 72 hours, it would be Richard apologizing publicly. And this time, the cameras would be rolling for entirely different reasons. The party continued around us, but the real performance was yet to begin. The situation quickly deteriorated when Richard decided to turn my father into interactive entertainment for his guests. "William, you must have some interesting stories from the hospital," Richard continued, now literally walking around my father like a predator studying its prey. "Tell us about the most unusual patients you've encountered." The cameras moved in closer. Flashes went off. 500 people watched in silence, waiting for the next moment of humiliation they could share on their social media as evidence that they had been present at the event of the year. My father remained silent, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly as he held the glass of water. I recognized that posture. It was the same one he had when I was a child and other parents made cruel comments about our financial situation during school events. "Come on, William," Jessica joined the spectacle, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Dad's just trying to include you in the conversation. You don't want to seem antisocial, do you?" It was then that I realized the true extent of the orchestrated cruelty. This wasn't spontaneous, it was planned. Jessica had prepared Richard for this moment, providing him with details about my father's insecurities, his vulnerabilities, the exact points to press for maximum embarrassment. "Actually," Richard raised his voice so the entire room could hear, "I'm curious about one specific thing. Eric told us you work the night shift, right? That means you clean up after people do. Well, you know." The implication was clear and disgusting. Richard was trying to paint my father as someone who dealt with human waste, reducing 26 years of dedicated service to a degrading caricature. I felt my jaw tighten. My hands clenched into fists involuntarily. The low hum of conversation ceased completely. Even the most insensitive guests realized that Richard had crossed a line. But the worst was yet to come. "Dad, stop," I muttered through clenched teeth. "Stop what?" Jessica turned to me with a look of feigned innocence. "He's just making conversation. You're being overly sensitive, as usual." As usual. Those words reverberated in my mind like an alarm bell. How many times had Jessica used those words to invalidate my reaction to her cruel behavior? How many times had she convinced me that my perception of reality was wrong? "William," Richard continued, completely oblivious to the palpable discomfort in the room, "have you ever thought about evolving professionally? Maybe taking a technical course? Eric could pay for it, now that he's doing so well." The insult was multi-layered. It suggested that my father was lazy for not moving up, that I was obligated to support his late-life ambitions, and that our family needed the Blackwell's charity for any kind of progress. That's when my phone vibrated discreetly in my pocket. The message I had been waiting for had finally arrived. "Transfers complete. You now own 52.3% of the outstanding shares of Blackwell Holdings. Congratulations, Mr. Manning. You are officially the majority shareholder." I looked at my father, still standing in the center of the room like a wounded animal, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't just anger, it was crystal clear clarity about who I really was and what I was willing to tolerate. For 3 years, I had convinced myself that I could be a bridge between two worlds. That my love for Jessica and my respect for her family would eventually earn a legitimate place for me and my father in her social circle. That patience and humility would lead us to acceptance. I was completely wrong. Right now, watching my father being humiliated for pure entertainment, I realized that we were never seen as human beings worthy of basic respect. We were charity projects, interesting mascots, convenient reminders of their own generosity. "Actually, Richard," my voice cut through the air like a sharp blade, causing all conversation to cease immediately, "I think it's time for a different conversation." Richard turned to me, his eyes shining with anticipation. He expected an emotional outburst, a desperate reaction he could use to paint me as unstable and confirm his suspicions about my unsuitability for the family. Instead, I walked calmly over to where my father was standing and placed my hand on his shoulder. "Dad," I said softly, "you can go home now. I'll take care of the rest." William looked at me with an expression that was a mixture of gratitude and concern. He knew that tone in my voice. It was the same one I used as a child, just before doing something I knew would have serious consequences. "Eric," Jessica whispered urgently, "don't make a scene. You'll regret it." I smiled at her, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You're right about one thing, Jessica. Someone here is definitely going to regret this." As my father discreetly made his way to the exit, Accompanied by the curious glances of the guests, I pulled out my phone and began typing a message to my corporate lawyer. Activate the hostile takeover protocol tomorrow at 9 a.m. time to take control of Blackwell Holdings. Richard was now chatting animatedly with a group of investors near the bar, clearly enjoying his cruel performance. Jessica had joined her friends, probably sharing intimate details about my family's social inadequacies. None of them realized that while they reveled in their supposed victory, I was quietly orchestrating the most spectacular fall from grace Connecticut had seen in decades. The irony was that Richard had spent years teaching me exactly how to destroy a business empire through hostile takeovers. Over countless family dinners, he had described in sadistic detail how he identified vulnerable companies, how he exploited weaknesses in ownership structure, how he used insider information to destabilize competitors. He had given me a master's degree in corporate warfare, assuming I would never be smart enough to apply those lessons against him. Once again, Richard Blackwell had seriously underestimated his opposition. As the party raged around me, loud laughter, conversations about politics and business, the constant clinking of crystal glasses, I mentally ran through every step of the plan I would execute over the next 72 hours. First, I would assume operational control of Blackwell Holdings through my majority stake. Second, I would order a complete audit of all contracts and partnerships from the past 5 years. Third, I would use my new authority to expose every questionable scheme, every ethical shortcut, every financial manipulation Richard had used to build his empire. But the most satisfying element of my plan wasn't public revenge, it was education. Richard would spend the rest of his life learning exactly how it feels to be underestimated, disrespected, and treated like a social inconvenience. Eric, a female voice, interrupted my thoughts. It was Catherine Thornfield, an investigative journalist with Bloomberg who covered corporate scandals on the East Coast. Catherine, I greeted her cordially. What a surprise to see you here. Oh, Richard invited me personally, she smiled mischievously. He said there would be some interesting revelations tonight about corporate restructuring in the region. My heart raced. Richard didn't know that Catherine was known for exposing questionable corporate practices. He had just invited the fox to guard the henhouse, assuming his own reputation was unassailable. How interesting, I replied calmly. I'm sure it will be a memorable evening for everyone involved. Catherine studied me for a moment, clearly detecting something in my tone. You know, she said thoughtfully, I've always found it fascinating how certain families manage to maintain such impeccable facades for so long. Until someone with inside knowledge decides that the truth needs to come out. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I realized that Catherine wasn't here by chance. She was hunting a story, and she had just identified a potential source with privileged access to the inner workings of Blackwell Holdings. I smiled genuinely for the first time that evening. Catherine, I said softly, how about we meet for coffee tomorrow morning? I have a feeling you'll want to hear what I have to share. As we exchanged contact information, Richard continued his cruel performance in the center of the room, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just provided his future tormentor with both the motivation and the perfect opportunity for his complete destruction. The party around us pulsed with energy, music, and laughter, but all I could hear was the silent sound of an empire about to crumble. And this time, it would be my father watching from home, comfortably, while Richard learned what it meant to be publicly humiliated. The real party was just getting started. The morning after the party, at 7:15 a.m., I was sitting in the office of my corporate lawyer, Marcus Chun, in Manhattan. The meeting had been scheduled at 3 a.m. by text message. Marcus knew that urgent client calls meant lucrative opportunities. 52.3%, he confirmed, flipping through the transfer documents. Officially, you are the majority shareholder of Blackwell Holdings as of yesterday at 4:45 p.m. I smiled, remembering the exact moment I received that confirmation. While Richard was publicly humiliating my father, I was gaining legal control of his company. Marcus, I need you to prepare 3 things. First, a call for an extraordinary board meeting for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Second, a full forensic audit of all contracts from the last 5 years. Third, an order for Richard Blackwell's immediate removal from any executive function. Marcus stopped typing and looked at me directly. Eric, are you sure? This will create a full-scale war. Richard has powerful connections, the resources to fight this in court for years. He had 3 years to treat me like a human being, I replied calmly. He chose to use that time to turn me into family entertainment. Now it's my turn to choose. What Marcus didn't know, And what Richard had never suspected was that my quiet acquisition of the shares had not been motivated by corporate ambition, but by self-preservation. During the first 2 years of my marriage, I had noticed a disturbing pattern in the Blackwell family's jokes. First came the seemingly innocent comments about my background. Then came the suggestions that I should be more grateful for the opportunities my marriage had given me. Finally, the veiled threats that if I didn't behave properly, I could lose everything very quickly. Richard had made the classic mistake of every domestic tyrant. He assumed his victim was stupid. For 18 months, I meticulously documented every questionable transaction of Blackwell Holdings. Contracts awarded without bidding. Bribes disguised as consulting fees. Tax evasion through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Richard had built an empire, but it was built on a rotten foundation. The Bloomberg journalist, I continued, Catherine Thornfield. She wants an exclusive interview tomorrow afternoon. Prepare a complete dossier, numbers, dates, documents. Everything legal and verifiable. Marcus shook his head slowly. How long have you been planning this? Since the first dinner at their house, I admitted. When Richard told me I should give thanks every day that I was born in a country where janitors can raise architects. At that moment, I realized he would never see me as an equal. Just an interesting social experiment. As we spoke, my phone vibrated with a message from Jessica. Dad wants to talk to you about last night. He said you were disrespectful and need to learn boundaries. Come home early. I showed the message to Marcus, who let out a bitter laugh. She really thinks you're going to apologize? She thinks I'm the same man who married her 3 years ago, I replied. That man wanted their approval desperately. This man just wants justice. The irony was delicious. For 3 years, Richard had inadvertently taught me everything about hostile takeovers, market manipulation, and corporate warfare. Over endless family dinners, he described in sadistic detail how he identified vulnerable companies, how he exploited weaknesses in corporate structures, how he used insider information to destroy competitors. Each story was told as a lesson in how business really works, assuming I was too young and naive to apply these techniques against him. Once again, Richard Blackwell had seriously underestimated his opposition. What about Jessica? Marcus asked. I stopped signing documents and looked at him directly. Jessica made her choice last night when she laughed at my father's humiliation. She can stay with the family she chose to defend. At 11 in the morning, I was back at my architecture office in the financial district, reviewing the final plans. My secretary, Linda, brought me coffee and looked at me curiously. Mr. Manning, there are reporters outside. They say they want comments on developments at Blackwell Holdings. Do you know what they're talking about? I smiled. News traveled fast in the Connecticut business world. Linda, starting tomorrow, we'll have a lot of visitors from the press. Prepare a conference room and make sure we have enough coffee. If you followed this journey so far and want to find out how one man turned years of systematic humiliation into the most spectacular takeover in Connecticut business history, subscribe to the channel. Because tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock sharp, Richard Blackwell would discover that underestimating people has devastating consequences. At 4:45, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Eric, it's Richard. We need to talk. Urgent. There was a tone to her voice I'd never heard before, not the usual arrogance, but something closer to controlled panic. Sure, Richard. How about tomorrow morning? 9 o'clock? At the Blackwell Holdings office. A long silence. Eric, what have you done? Nothing yet, I replied calmly. But at 9 in the morning, I'll start dismantling everything you've built using the same tactics you taught me. I hung up before he could respond. From my office window, I watched the sun set over Manhattan. In 12 hours, Richard Blackwell would discover that humiliating hard-working families in public comes at a very specific price. And that price was exactly the value of a $300 million business empire. At 9 o'clock sharp, I entered the Blackwell Holdings boardroom as if it were any other Monday morning. Richard was already there, accompanied by Jessica, 3 members of the board of directors, and 2 lawyers I didn't recognize. Their faces showed a mixture of confusion and contained irritation. Clearly, no one understood why I had called an emergency meeting. Eric, Richard stood up, his voice trying to maintain its usual authority. I hope you have a very good explanation for this procedural irregularity. I smiled calmly as I placed my briefcase on the main table, the same table where, for 3 years, I had been treated as a tolerated guest rather than a member of the family. Actually, I do, Richard. Marcus, please begin. My corporate lawyer entered through the side door, carrying a box of documents and accompanied by 2 forensic auditors whom Richard recognized immediately. The irritated expression on his face turned to something closer to alarm. Gentlemen, Marcus announced formally, as the majority shareholder of Blackwell Holdings, Mr. Eric Manning is exercising his right to assume immediate operational control of this company. The silence that followed was deafening. This is ridiculous, Jessica finally exploded. Eric doesn't own enough shares to. 52.3%, I interrupted softly, sliding the transfer documents across the table. Legally acquired over the last 18 months through 3 different investment entities. Richard took the papers with slightly shaking hands. His eyes scanned the numbers, the dates, the signatures. With each line, his face paled further. That's not possible, he muttered. I would have been notified of any significant acquisition. Only of acquisitions above 5% by individual entity, Marcus explained with professional satisfaction. Mr. Manning was very careful to structure the purchases through multiple companies, keeping each one below the mandatory disclosure threshold. It was at that moment that Richard understood completely. His eyes met mine across the table, and I saw the exact instant when reality crystallized in his mind. For 3 years, while he had underestimated me as an unsuitable son-in-law, I had quietly dismantled the foundations of his empire. You planned this, his voice was almost a whisper. From the beginning. Not from the beginning, I corrected honestly. From the first dinner at your house, when you told me I should give thanks every day for living in a country where janitors can raise architects. That was when I realized you would never see me as a human being. Jessica tried one last desperate maneuver. Eric, stop this madness. You're destroying our family over a misinterpreted joke. Dad didn't mean. Jessica, I cut her off firmly, your father wasn't joking last night. He was systematically humiliating my father for the entertainment of 500 people. And you laughed. I turned my attention back to Richard, who was still staring at the documents as if he could make the numbers change through sheer force of will. But Eric, Richard tried to regain control of the situation. Even assuming this is legal, you can't just show up and dash. Actually, I can, Marcus interrupted, handing him a second set of documents. Here's the court order authorizing immediate forensic audit of all Blackwell Holdings contracts, transactions, and partnerships for the last 5 years. The auditors were already setting up their equipment, preparing to comb through every file, every account, every document in the company. Richard stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. This is personal revenge. You're using corporate resources to settle family scores. No, I replied calmly. I'm using corporate resources to investigate legitimate suspicions of corporate mismanagement. Suspicions that have arisen during my 3 years as a silent observer of your business practices. It was then that I handed Richard a folder I had carefully prepared. Project Clearwater, a $200 million contract with the city, but only $60 million in actual work performed. Apex Limited Consulting, a company that received $15 million in fees but has no physical office or registered employees. The Blackwell Foundation for Urban Development, which transferred $7 million to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Every word I uttered made Richard shrink further into his chair. Jessica was white as a sheet, finally understanding that this wasn't a case of a husband throwing a tantrum, it was an ongoing criminal investigation. You documented everything, Richard whispered. For 3 years, I confirmed. Every dinner where you described your business strategies. Every time you explained how business really works. Every story about how to eliminate competitors through questionable tactics. Marcus smiled as he handed over more documents. Oh, and Mr. Blackwell? Bloomberg reporter Catherine Thornfield will be here at 2 p.m. for an exclusive interview about corporate practices in the Connecticut real estate industry. Richard's world crumbled visibly and completely. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with the silent collapse of someone who finally understands that he has made an irreversible mistake. Eric, his voice now carried a humility I had never heard before. Can we talk? Just the 2 of us? Maybe we can work this out, as a family. I rose from my chair, the chair that was now officially mine as interim CEO of Blackwell Holdings. Richard, I said softly, We are not family. Last night you made that very clear when you humiliated my father in front of 500 people. Today, you're finding out how it feels to be humiliated in front of an audience. I walked over to the panoramic window that offered a view of the entire Connecticut financial district. The difference is that my father's humiliation was gratuitous and cruel. Yours is a direct consequence of decades of illegal practices that you meticulously documented, thinking you would never be discovered. When I turned around, Richard had his head in his hands. Jessica was crying silently. The board members avoided eye contact. The auditors estimate they'll need 72 hours to complete their initial review, Marcus announced. But based on the preliminary documentation, we expect to uncover enough irregularities to. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood perfectly. Richard Blackwell wasn't just losing control of the company, he was losing his freedom. And as I watched the man who had spent years treating me like his daughter's charity project, I felt not cruel satisfaction, but a strange sense of justice finally being served. The real lesson was just beginning. 72 hours later, Richard Blackwell was handcuffed in front of the Blackwell Holdings building, escorted by federal agents as reporters from 3 national networks captured every second of his public fall. The forensic audit had revealed a corruption scheme that spanned an entire decade. Inflated contracts, shell companies, systematic tax evasion. The empire Richard had built with such pride was crumbling like a house of cards under the relentless light of the investigation. "Mr. Blackwell," shouted a reporter, "any comment on the charges of $67 million in fraud?" Richard kept his head down as he was placed in the police car. There was no more arrogance, no more condescending smiles. Just a 62-year-old man facing the consequences of decades of systematic cruelty. Catherine Thornfield had kept her promise. Her Bloomberg story, titled "The Empire Built on Sand: How a Janitor Toppled a Real Estate Tycoon," had been republished by the Wall Street Journal, CNN, and dozens of other outlets. The story wasn't just about corporate fraud, it was about poetic justice, working-class dignity, and the inevitable fall of arrogance. Jessica tried to call me 87 times over those 3 days. I didn't answer any of them. Finally, she showed up at my office unannounced, her eyes red from crying. "Eric, you got what you wanted," she said, her voice breaking. "Dad's going to prison. The company is ruined. I'm being evicted from my home. Are you satisfied?" I looked up from the documents I was reviewing, plans to turn Blackwell Holdings into a popular housing cooperative specializing in projects for working families. "Jessica," I replied calmly, "your father didn't go to prison because I wanted revenge. He went because he stole $67 million of public funds intended for popular housing. The same housing that families like mine desperately need." She sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. "But we were a family," she whispered. "You destroyed our family." "No," I corrected her gently. "You destroyed our family the moment you decided my father was entertainment. That our background was a joke. That our dignity was negotiable." I picked up a photograph from my desk, my father and me on my graduation day from architecture school. He was wearing the same suit he wore to the Christmas party, smiling with genuine pride. "You know what the difference is between our fathers, Jessica? Mine built a man. Yours built a thief." 2 months later, the transformation was complete. The former Blackwell Holdings had become the Manning Development Group, focused exclusively on affordable housing and community revitalization. Our first partnership was with St. Mary's Hospital, where my father worked, building housing units for healthcare workers. On the day of the project's inauguration, my father cut the ceremonial ribbon wearing his best suit, the same one he wore to his graduation, the same one he wore to the party. But this time, when the cameras focused on him, it wasn't as an object of humiliation, but as a symbol of dignity earned. 26 years cleaning hospital rooms," he said into the microphone, his voice clear and proud, "taught me that every person deserves a safe, clean place to call home. My son has just made that possible on a larger scale." The audience, made up of nurses, janitors, technicians, working families, applauded as if he were a celebrity. And in that moment, to all of us, he really was. Richard was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Jessica moved to Oregon, where she got a job as a receptionist at a veterinary clinic. I hear she finally learned the value of honest work. Marcus Chin told me that our story had become a case study in law schools about how meticulous documentation can bring down corporate corruption schemes. Several other families who had been harmed by Richard's developments found the courage to sue using our evidence. The real satisfaction didn't come from Richard's downfall, but from the rebuilding that followed. Every family that moved into our housing units, every worker who found decent housing close to employment, every child who grew up in a safe environment because we rejected the normalization of cruelty. A year later, I received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a simple card: "Thank you for teaching me that there is a difference between success and meaning. R.B." Richard had written from prison. I didn't ask for forgiveness or offer reconciliation. Some bridges burn to protect what's on the safe side. 3 weeks ago, I stumbled across an old photo of us from my first Christmas with the Blackwell family. We were all smiling for the camera, looking like the picture of family bliss. I kept the photo not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the price of confusing privilege with character. The most important transformation did not happen to Richard or Jessica, but to me. I understood that true power does not come from humiliating others, but from lifting up those who have been knocked down. That real justice is not revenge, but the creation of systems where systematic cruelty becomes impossible. Last month, my father retired after 28 years at St. Mary's Hospital. His farewell party was broadcast on local television, not as a curiosity, but as recognition of 3 decades of dedicated service to the community. During his speech, he said, "I taught my son that dignity doesn't come from what you have, but from how you treat people." It seems he listened. If this story of transformation, justice, and regained dignity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel. Share it with people who need to be reminded that cruelty has an expiration date, but kindness builds lasting legacies. The last I heard, Richard was participating in a prison rehabilitation program, teaching other inmates about basic financial planning. Ironic, considering he destroyed the finances of hundreds of families. Me? Well, I'm here on the roof of the Manning Development Group building, watching the sun set over Connecticut, knowing that every light is a family that found a decent home through honest work. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply to live well while building a better world for others. And that's a victory no humiliation can take away from you.